Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dager, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Tony Allwork. Tony is the pioneer of the jobs to be done theory, the inventor of the outcome-driven innovation process, and the founder of the strategy innovation consulting firm Stratagen. His latest book, Jobs to be Done, solidifies this framework and picks up where his first book might have left off, which was What Customers Want. So, Tony, thanks for joining me. And I'm not sure everyone knows you've been what I might call a process person your whole life. Did you start out in the quality field, or where did that process bug take root?
Well, thanks, Joe. Well, you've heard the terms QFD, right? You're familiar with QFD?
Sure.
Yeah, I've filled out lots of matrices in my days back in my early IBM days. I actually started as a process engineer working for IBM back in the 1980s. And I worked on their PC line. I created a few printer products first, then moved over to the PC line. And so my background's actually in process engineering, and in manufacturing. So back in those days, statistical process control was getting big. Six Sigma was just starting. So my background in all of this really comes from that perspective.
Well, in your earlier work, in your first book, What the Customer Wants, the subtitle contains outcome-driven innovation.
Right.
And how does or did the ODI segue into jobs to be done, or is it something completely different?
No, it's actually the same thing. So I can tell the story, but we started thinking about outcome-driven innovation back in the late 80s, early 90s. It really occurred to me back in around 1990 timeframe how all this could work. And I'll even go back a little farther than that. I worked on a product called the PC Junior at IBM, and it was a horrible failure. In fact, the day after it was introduced in the Wall Street Journal, the headlines read, PC Junior is a flop. And I thought, well, that's bad news. But what it really got me thinking about was, how did they figure that out? In other words, there's some metrics they were using to decide that product was a failure. And I thought, gosh, if we only knew what those metrics were well in advance, we could just design the product around those metrics and have a winning product. So that got me down this path thinking, what are those metrics? And then years later, it occurred to me that if we focused on the underlying process that people were executing instead of the product or the customer, then we could actually break it down like we break down a manufacturing process, right? We could look at that and break it down step by step and then apply metrics to it. In the manufacturing world, the way we say it is, we need to figure out what do we need to measure and control to produce a predictable output, right? And what we're saying here is, what do we need to measure and control to ensure we can help customers achieve that underlying process to a greater degree? So that was the thinking, and then that was the birth of outcome-driven innovation. I started Stratagen in 1991. We had lots of really great successes early on and continued through the 90s. And in 1999, I introduced the concept to Clay Christensen. I read his book, The Innovator's Solution, when it came out. The Innovator's Dilemma, loved it, and thought that outcome-driven innovation was really a possible solution to the innovator's dilemma. So I called him up and told him that I thought that, and he was kind enough to offer me an invite to come see him. So went and visited Clay in his office in Harvard and introduced him to outcome-driven innovation. And we met a few times over the subsequent years, but he really liked the idea that we focused on the underlying process and not the product or the customer. And in years after that, before he wrote The Innovator's Solution, I met with him again. He talked about the idea that the underlying process really wasn't that sexy. It doesn't flow very nicely. So the underlying job sounds a lot better. And the concept of the job to be done was born. And Clay put that in his book, in The Innovator's Solution. He cited our work and contributions from that point. And that chapter really became a very often cited part of that book. And Jobs to be Done, that was back in 2003. And it slowly took off and then has gained a lot of momentum in the last 10 years or so.
Certainly has, and it's on. It seems it's really gained momentum in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think as people are trying it and seeing that it's successful, it's just gaining more and more momentum. So it's just great. Like I said, we've been at this for 25 years now. We just celebrated our 25-year anniversary last month.
I saw that. I saw that. Well, tell me, is it because maybe one of the reasons it's starting to get more popular is it because people are more acceptable to process and process thinking in design, that we're starting to get, say, oh, we brought the OODA loop in, we brought the lean startup, IDEO's design thinking, but that underlying process of gathering that information to a client is the key, and that your process seems to do it. Are we just, maybe are we more receptive to processes? Is that maybe a decent hypothesis?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. It's I don't think people really love process, especially when it comes to innovation. They often say that I've read lots of articles that say process kills innovation. And of course, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there has to be a process for innovation so you can execute it in a way that mitigates risk, and that's what we've been all about for all this time. But I think that people are tired of failing. I think that's probably more of the motivation. When you see these, 5% success rates or 95% failure rates for all these years, I think people are just getting tired of it. And I think the movement is also taking hold in the startup space, where I don't think people have the patience anymore for failing. Pivoting and failing fast sound exciting, but learning fast and getting it right the first time is even more appealing. And I think there's a larger number of people who think that and are heading down that path and finding ways to adopt the Jobs thinking theory and bringing it to life.
Your offer as a Kindle Unlimited book is fantastic for people to pick that up. I can't imagine anyone, in business that doesn't pick it up if they're a Kindle member, okay? I would like to thank you very much, Tony. This podcast will be available on Business 901 iTunes Store and the Business 901 blog site. So thank all the listeners for listening.